Great. So Bud Talks. We're going to take the last part of the conference today to describe this CMCR Knowledge Translation Initiative. We're going to get a little bit of a snapshot into our process of moving knowledge into action and the products that we're developing. Okay, so I'm speaking now, but I'm only one person part of a team. And we're going to present as a team today. We've described this work before as taking a village. I'm going to introduce a few people with me today. Deirdre Querney, who's a counselor at Alcohol, Drug and Gambling Services of Hamilton. We started working together in 2016, incredibly now, many years, on knowledge translation, just the two of us with some very specific ideas. Since then, the team has expanded quite a bit. We have many different students working with us: Nikki Pangborn, Sarah Brassard, Luke Barkovich. We also had a student from Mohawk working with us for the summer as well. We have an instructional designer who will be joining us virtually as well, Jean-Pierre Joubert. Some animators from I Am Static, a graphic designer, Krista Joubert. We have addiction psychiatrists such as Dr. Jen Brash, and geriatric psychiatrists like Dr. Sophia Benjamin, who are helping out as well. So, what exactly is KT, or knowledge translation? We hear this buzzword all the time now. As researchers, we're very, very aware about publishing findings from clinical research. We need to do it. It's very important. There's a lot of pressure to get publications in peer-reviewed journals. But slowly, we're also beginning to realize that publishing is not enough anymore. We're starting to recognize this fundamental role of KT, or knowledge translation, and how important it is in closing the gap from knowledge to practice. And so I'm sure you've heard many different terms about KT. They differ a little bit depending on what country you're in. Anne McKibben, who's actually a researcher at McMaster University, has identified over 90 terms used for KT research. So in the States, you'll hear more words like dissemination, diffusion. In Canada, we use a lot of knowledge translation, knowledge transfer and exchange. In the UK, you hear about, for example, implementation science. And CIHR has really led the way in terms of promoting knowledge translation and embedding it in a knowledge creation, a knowledge translation framework. So they have this knowledge to action process in which the process of creating knowledge and then translating it into practice should be iterative and dynamic. So constantly interacting with the natural cyclical nature and having feedback loops at different periods where you get feedback from key stakeholders. So I'm going to transfer it now to Deirdre to tell us a little bit more. Just press this one forward.
Okay. Hello. Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Deirdre. I'm the social worker in this village. Thank you for staying right to the bitter end here. Not bitter, the wonderful end. Here we go. So knowledge translation is basically working to bridge the gap between knowledge and practice. And so cannabis researchers, they often don't talk directly to their stakeholders. And those stakeholders could be clinicians like myself, regulators, clients, patients, other people, the public. So there's often a gap between those research findings and knowledge at the front lines. I have to say, the average person is not aware of the latest research or how to interpret it. And so that means that our decisions, as clinicians, I'm speaking from that point of view, they're not always evidence-informed. And cannabis research continues to rapidly evolve, as we've been hearing at this conference, especially since cannabis legalization. Researchers do play a crucial role in raising awareness about the research findings and also making those findings easier to access and to use. So one of the key points about knowledge translation is that it requires different groups to work together and share their perspectives. The result of this is the creation of a product that couldn't have been produced with any one person alone. And Bud Talks is being produced by CMCR researchers and clinicians together, along with a team of animators and instructional designers. So it's a really good example of knowledge translation. As Era said, this is not our first KT rodeo. We've done knowledge translation before. And so just a little plug here for Brain Connections, which was our first effort and is now an award-winning knowledge translation production. We did some work on helping to translate knowledge about gambling addiction or gambling disorder. And so we have clinical handouts that clinicians can use with clients. We have something called the B briefs, which can be used by responsible gambling operators or just the public in general. We have an educational video that you can see going on here. And we're just finalizing a French translation of our work, and that should come out by the end of this year. And so our goal with the work that we do is to create products that facilitate learning, that they're engaging, they reduce stigma, and they're accessible for a broad range of literacy levels. So hopefully you'll go to brainconnections.ca just to check it out. In an age of misinformation, knowledge translation is an increasingly important way to communicate research to the audiences who need it. Cannabis misinformation, as you all know, is particularly bad. The web, social media, many anecdotal reports come in at us like a tsunami of misinformation. So KT is important for the public because people need the best information at their fingertips in order to make decisions about their use. Knowledge translation links the creation of knowledge from research areas to real-world situations. There are specific interest groups such as veterans with PTSD, pregnant women, people with specific health conditions. They all have questions about cannabis that require accurate answers. KT is also really important for educators so that they are relaying accurate information to their students and not contributing to the myths that exist about cannabis. And KT is super important for clinicians like myself. And there are really 4 reasons for this. First is that people really have questions and we need to have the right answers for them. On a daily basis in my work with folks who have addiction concerns, I am asked all sorts of questions all the time about cannabis. People will ask me, is it safe? Will it cure my ADHD? Why can't I sleep when I'm not taking it? Will I get psychosis? Is what I'm doing okay? If it's natural, doesn't that mean it's safe? Isn't it better to use cannabis than other drugs? These are totally valid questions, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who gets them if you work in the field. But where do we get our answers from? And how do we stay up to date with this evidence when cannabis research isn't actually all that easy to interpret, and it's so quickly changing? It's a huge challenge for clinicians. There are tons of myths in social media amongst cannabis users, and even at the dispensaries, that need to be dispelled. Not to mention that clinicians, depending on when we were educated, we might have views that aren't or maybe no longer evidence-based. So we ourselves need to be updated regularly. The second reason that KT is so important for clinicians is because relapses happen due to misinformation. So because of the myths and beliefs that people have about cannabis, people's attempts at making change are often deterred or interrupted. This is a really common example that comes up in my work a lot. People take cannabis to sleep and to unwind, and then let's say they decide to stop, and then they say, oh, my sleep gets so much worse. Now, I know this is because of withdrawal, quite likely, but people might interpret it as a reason to keep using cannabis. They might not see it as withdrawal. Another reason this work is so important for clinicians is that risk is minimized and misunderstood. So when it comes to substance use, people tend to spend time with people who do what they're doing. So people who use cannabis tend to spend time with people who use cannabis and think the same way that they do. This is what we call the echo chamber. So when it comes to cannabis, people often get their information from the sources in their own social network, which can be biased in a certain way and not always evidence-informed. As a result, the risks of cannabis use can be minimized or just simply misunderstood. So when people come to folks like myself, we need to be reliable sources of information because we might be the only person offering a different perspective from the person's social network. And And the last reason this is so important for clinicians is that even good information may not be engaging, unbiased, accessible, or non-stigmatizing. Bud Talks is designed so that people can understand the content. It's written at a grade 6 level of comprehension to make it accessible. And we're working really hard to create metaphors and imagery that gets people's attention and keeps them interested long enough to read the content. Above all, we are keeping to the CMCR's mantra of being pro-evidence as opposed to pro or anti-cannabis. In this way, clinicians can feel confident sending people to access Bud Talks, knowing that they will not come away feeling judged or stigmatized. So this knowledge translation initiative is working to develop a series of products for a general audience based on the current state of research on cannabis. Specific topics will include drug interactions and cannabis use disorder, and stakeholders will focus on the general population, but also specifically on older adults. So our goal is to produce a variety of free KT products for the general public to access. And this time around, we're focusing particularly on promoting the CMCR as a resource for the general public on current cannabis knowledge, on developing KT products on the interaction of drugs with cannabinoids, to develop KT products around cannabis use disorder, and to provide students an opportunity to participate and learn more about knowledge translation. As you can see, there are many steps in the process before we can actually have products to share with you. And the first step is determining who your stakeholders are. Is it the public, clinicians, patients, regulators? And then we have to do some informal surveys to get a sense of what they know about this topic and what questions or concerns they might have. So Nikki's going to take over. Nikki's a graduate student in the neuroscience program at MAC, and she's going to tell us a bit more about these surveys that were conducted.
All right, yeah, so I'll be talking about the process of conducting our surveys. So essentially what we did is we created some short form surveys. They were not systematic or exhaustive, but they provided us with a good snapshot of people's understanding of cannabis and some questions that they might have. So we developed questions based on 3 central themes of cannabis use, so cannabis use disorder, drug interactions, and cannabis and the brain. From that, we individualized 4 separate questionnaires for our groups of interest. So we surveyed general community members, dispensary employees, pharmacists, and older adults, so people 65 and older. We conducted these surveys in person. We ended up with 65 total surveys, and we also provided an online survey form to seniors, which we received 8 responses from. So I'll be talking about some of the key themes and questions that we identified from these responses. So general community members describe typically asking questions through just general Google searches. So people didn't have a particular resource or website that they typically ask questions. And people also found it quite easy to ask questions about cannabis, particularly due to online accessibility. However, there were still some remaining perceptions of stigma and complexity of available content. So we can see from some example responses, people find it easy, but they find it difficult to ask questions about more stigmatizing topics like falling into a bad cycle. And another person describes difficulty with understanding different meanings or language that's used surrounding cannabis. Surprisingly, general community members and dispensary employees had mostly never heard of cannabis use disorder. Some general respondents actually didn't believe that cannabis could be addictive. This person describes here that cannabis users are mellow and they don't think that there's problems associated with cannabis use, whereas some people compared it to other addictions such as alcohol. Dispensary employees, despite largely not knowing what cannabis use disorder is, they provided pretty good answers of what they think problematic cannabis use might look like, typically saying that it's a reliance on cannabis use daily. Pharmacists note that the most important drug interactions to look out for with seniors are with antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications, particularly due to the drowsiness effects that can arise. One other thing that we found interesting is when I was asking or conducting surveys in dispensaries, I actually had an employee provide me with this information sheet, and it's apparently actually required to be distributed at every cannabis retailer. However, I had never seen it before. I asked around and no one else had also ever seen it. So again, it's important to note that this information does exist, but even in places where people are purchasing cannabis, it's still inaccessible. Looking at our responses from seniors, none of the seniors we interviewed actually had discussed interactive effects of medication and cannabis with their healthcare providers, despite a lot of them using cannabis and other medications. But they did have some interesting questions that arose. So one person wanted to understand how healthcare providers take into account ingredients and dosage of cannabis when making a medical marijuana plant. As well, one person wanted to know if they should be concerned about the risks of smoking cannabis as they are with cigarettes. So this person had quit smoking cigarettes, but they still continued to smoke cannabis. And this is a common theme we saw within people's responses. People typically draw comparisons to other substances they're more familiar with, like alcohol and nicotine. So again, these are important things we can take away from our survey responses, is the language people use and how they think about cannabis. And these are all things we can apply in the products that we create with Bud Talks.
Great. So from here we go on to the literature review. We looked into many of the different topics that came up through the surveys. It's very easy to go down many rabbit holes in specific areas. For example, in CUD, it can be very overwhelming. And at the same time, in other areas, like with drug interactions, there's a real dearth of information, particularly as it relates to drug dosages. So for our focus, we decided on talking a little bit about the spectrum of cannabis use. So it's not either or. We wanted to look at basic prevalence rates of just general use all the way up to cannabis use disorder. And we wanted to give an overview of CUD as in a very accessible way. So giving very specific examples of each symptom, walking through what it actually might look like. And we also wanted to target misconceptions too. So in the case of drug interactions for seniors, which happens quite frequently, and pharmacists were quite clear in saying that they really need good information, and it's clear that you don't always get that at the dispensary. So after much discussion, we decided that for cannabis use disorder, an illustrated booklet would make the most sense. And for the drug interactions topic, because it's with an older adult population, having cards, sort of large postcards with specific drug information, informing people of risks and contraindications, also providing them with questions that they can ask their healthcare provider. Our idea is that this would also be available at pharmacies, and pharmacists could hand some of these out as well. So all of this information will be available on the website, which will provide further links to additional research, to additional information for people. So if they want to go to additional resources or some of the original papers. And so in this way, we can get a sort of multi-level approach, or a layered approach of information that can serve different levels of interest. So now we have a little bit more of an idea of the focus and the ideas around our products. We've done the literature reviews. As researchers, it's not that difficult. It's labor intensive, but it's not that difficult often to ask questions, to find answers. We can run studies to answer the questions we have. We can look at the current state of the evidence. But the other job that we have as researchers is to tell the story. And a good story will keep people interested and create a long-lasting impact. And we share stories all the time. Even what we're doing now, we're sharing a little bit about the process of conducting KT work. And storytelling is really this fundamental aspect of being human, and it helps us promote connection and understand experiences that other people are having. And it very quickly builds these connections between people and ideas and their experiences. And so it really is this incredibly valuable tool for learning. So one of the challenges of KT is not just presenting the facts, because we know we can do that, but developing a narrative around them so that the facts can stick. And if you think about it, we were talking about a tsunami of misinformation before. Anecdotes form a large part of this tsunami of misinformation. And anecdotes, if you think about it, are really a short story. It's a form of storytelling that's very compelling, and they tend to stick, and people often mistake those for facts. On the far extreme end, we have academic writing, which can sometimes be very bland with little emotion, and we often even value how objective we can be, how distanced and abstract we can be. And in doing this, I think we often, particularly in these areas, we lose the essence of the human condition. And so some people have described the anecdote antidote, which is using compelling storytelling of facts and metaphors. So what's in a name? We had to decide on a name for our project as well. It took a little bit of time. We wanted to convey that this is evidence-informed. We wanted, though, something that's easy to remember and straightforward, so we came up with things like blunt facts, higher knowledge. I think I had Canna Trust in my head. Turns out that most of these have already been taken by industry. So it was not easy necessarily to come up with a clear name. In the end, we decided on Bud Talks. And Bud is familiar, it's friendly, it's comfortable, it's also unpretentious. It also sounds a little bit like TED Talks, which most of you probably know. It's these talks that highlight very broad subject areas, and they currently shape our world and talk about important research and ideas. Bud Talks also suggests that our knowledge is still evolving, so the idea of budding knowledge. It's a conversation, it's short and memorable. It's also not a lecture. There's this idea that Bud can also talk to other characters too. So here's a little image of storyboarding. It doesn't look that exciting, but when we think about specific facts that we want to incorporate into our story, so for example, elements of cannabis use disorder, talking about prevalence rates, things like that, we can start to pair facts with images and how they're best presented. So as we get into the facts, we have to find this narrative to sort of join this all together. And one of the things that we came up with actually originally for Brain Connections was a driving metaphor, and we found that that took us very far. And this time with cannabis, Deirdre and I started talking about a maze, sort of getting into a maze, and this maze metaphor is getting us quite far as well. So it represents a highly cultivated system. It's fun, it's beautiful, it's magical, at least from afar, but once you're in it, you can get stuck and you realize how complicated and potentially treacherous it can be. So just like navigating cannabis use. And information is always helpful for getting out of a maze, whatever that means to people. It might be quitting, it might be deciding whether they want to initiate or use. And from here, we're going to seamlessly transition to online Zoom with Jean-Pierre presenting a little bit from his perspective as an instructional designer.
Perfect. Thanks, Iris. So we engaged with our animators at I Am Static, and we previously worked, as Deirdre had mentioned, with Brain Connections with them. And so we had created B and a brain emoji for Brain Connections. We developed, to develop the character, we developed a color palette. And obviously there's some greens, but other complementary colors. You see usually like the cannabis leaf on the internet, but this is actually not what most people see when they actually use cannabis. And so we wanted to have the character more relatable in that regard. And we decided to make Bud as our main character. And so we had a lot of asks for the animators. So can you make Cannabis Bud look attractive or an engaging character? A Bud's not the most attractive thing in the world to look at necessarily, but we wanted a character as well that would be knowledgeable. So Bud is familiar and friendly. He's comfortable, unpretentious. He had to be unique and recognizable as a Bud, but also not a Christmas tree or a cabbage. So the colors also had to be accurate, not only for the plant, but for the parts. So the pistils being more orange, leaves having orange tips, etc. And so after a bunch of back and forth, we ended up with Bud. And so this is Bud. And we really wanted him to have, again, a friendly and importantly, an engaging look. So wise eyes, shouldn't be naive. His eyebrows, the lines under the eyes show that he's lived a little bit. The coloration, to be honest, I shared a bit about, Granddaddy Purple. So getting a little bit more of those colors in and having a bit more of the darker greens where, some buds might be a little lighter. And so alongside Bud, we're developing more resources to help tell the stories. And we're starting again with cannabis use disorder, or CUD. And we wanted to begin by highlighting the range of cannabis use, so from no use all the way to addiction, as well as the risks and benefits of each stage. From a stigma standpoint, it was also important to note that none of these stages are a point of arrival, that a person can move fluidly back and forth between each of these stages over time. They might skip some, they might go back. And just from a visual identification perspective, we wanted to have a unique icon for each of these. And we were able to also reuse some of those portions later on, which I'll show you now. So we created another resource to highlight incentive salience, or for the layperson to show how CUD can shift your focus and emotions between mild, moderate, and severe stages. Essentially, we wanted to show how the more someone uses cannabis, the more they will become or be able to spot or notice cannabis-related cues. So these could be anything from spotting cannabis clothing in a shop to recognizing if somebody is smoking something near you or using cannabis near you, to even whether there's a new dispensary in town. And then another resource, a third resource that we've created, was a visual depiction of CUD symptoms, specifically according to the DSM-5. And so rather than a long list of criteria for CUD, we wanted to create memorable images, something that rapidly conveys some of the signs and the symptoms. It's important because it provides a quick, at-a-glance tool for cannabis users to know what signs to keep an eye out for. At the same time, though, it was important to be accurate according to DSM-5 and sensitive to the topic. So a key part of this was ensuring that there's no hierarchy presented. And that, especially for this image, that was really tough. So the scale, for example, CUD is based on a number of symptoms or identified symptoms here, not the severity of the symptoms or how they might be perceived. So something like withdrawal, that can tend to be seen as more concerning and on the severe end of whatever scale we might view. But as far as this scale is concerned, it's only one of 11 symptoms. And so DSM doesn't give more weight to any one symptom, even though something like withdrawal might be considered more concerning. Visually, we had to try and minimize any perceived differences. And because of this, to be frank, it may be necessary to edit this a little bit further because we do have some coloration differences between the rows. And because they are rows, they are technically grouped. So it's trying to balance all those things and, maybe making the colors for each of the backgrounds different would be important. We did also, one thing I forgot to mention with the previous slide, we had reused the cannabis leaf from the first slide in that slide. We've reused it here again. Similarly, we used, there's for high risk situations, there's a bit of a beetle or a jalopy type, someone swerving out of control while driving. And so we reused that image as well and just made it a little bit different. And back to you, Iris.
Many of these pieces, many of these assets that we're constructing. So we have these text image combinations in very small units, and we're slowly weaving these together in with the narrative about the CUD experience that's explained by Bud. So these booklets will be visually appealing. This is a little bit of, or you can see a little bit of a mock-up there. It will use accessible language and images, and it includes blocks of content or modules that in the end together will work to tell a complete story. I'll just go back one. For the drug interaction cards, we're also targeting specific drugs such as opiates, some of the anti-anxiety medication that was mentioned earlier as well, and working to provide health considerations as well as questions, tips, and links to other resources. And these cards, as I mentioned earlier, are targeted towards older adults. And so finally, our idea is that all of this information will be available on the CMCR website for the general public. It'll elaborate on some of the material in the cards and the booklet and direct people to other sources if they're interested. So our idea is to make these images, as I said, as modular as possible. So this means the content should be reusable. Anyone can get access to it. It should be easily adaptable and editable. All of the content, as I said, will be available for the general public to use as well. So this includes things like having access to all the layers in an image, making sure the backgrounds can be set to transparent, even making sure that the text is not only editable, but the fonts are multilingual too. This will allow us as well as researchers to reuse and repurpose some of the assets constructed here, but then adapt them to use in new assets as well. And by breaking the content into blocks, people using the site, such as educators or clinicians, can use these assets like Lego blocks and stack them or arrange them to create evidence-based content, to use them to make their own presentations, or use the ones that we put together and mold the blocks as needed. So I will just say very few things about the next steps. We're working on further developing and interweaving this narrative with the facts, with the content. And after this, one of the critical portions of KT is getting feedback from people, having people, for example, with CUD or older adults giving feedback about what's useful, what they like, what they don't like. Then we take this and integrate it back in. So there's this real iterative process that continues. And then finally, we have to work to promote widely, both in the community and then on the CMCR website as well. So thank you very much to the CMCR and to everyone for staying this long. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention.